brain injury shouldn't really make you smarter, but that is a genuine neurological phenomenon that's studied all around the world by peer-reviewed scientists. It's called acquired Savant Syndrome. Ben McMahon lived just down the road from me, as we say in Australia, in Victoria. And in 2012, he was involved in a serious car accident. In fact, he was so badly injured that the doctors placed him in an induced coma for a week. When he emerged from that coma, he was uncomfortable in his hospital bed, and so he called out to the Chinese nurse who was attending to him at the time, and was startled to find that what came out of his lips was Mandarin and not Australian English. Well, he was a bit bewildered by this, so he asked for a pad and a pen, and he wrote down a message which came out in Mandarin. Well, thankfully, his beautiful Australian English did return after a couple of weeks, but his facility in Mandarin remained. Now, like a lot of Australians, he had learned some Mandarin at school, but it wasn't his main language. He had never been that fluent in it. And all of a sudden, it was the language that his brain was reaching for, and he was speaking it with great proficiency. In fact, so well that he moved to China. He participated in a Chinese reality TV show and then studied in something quite technical at the university in Shanghai. And Mandarin remains an important part of his work to this day. Now, how did that happen? Ben, of course, has had to do his own reflecting on what all this means and why that happened. And he talks about the fact that our brains are brains of two lobes, and that to speak Australian English, you need a good communication going on between the two lobes of the brain. Both lobes are involved in terms of speaking English. But to speak an Asian language like Mandarin, you only need one lobe of the brain. Everything happens within that one lobe. And so if there's something that's inhibiting the communication between the two lobes of the brain, perhaps the brain just reached for the language that it could achieve within that one lobe of the brain. So his injury may have been reason enough to transfer his language from English to Mandarin. But what about the heightened proficiency? That is the aspect of acquired Savant Syndrome that so mystifies neuroscientists all around the world. Orlando Serrell was 10 years old when he was hit in the head by a baseball. It concussed him. But when he came to, being an enthusiastic baseball player of 10 years old, he just carried on and played the game, didn't tell his mum what had happened. But then he started developing very painful headaches, which continued for a full year after the incident. As the headaches began to recede, he noticed that he now had a phenomenal ability in calendar mathematics, something he did not have before. And so today, if you ask Orlando how many Wednesdays between the 29th of April 1953 and the 6th of March 1969, he'll tell you just like that. If you ask him what were you doing on the 26th of October 1986, he'll tell you just like that. All these things his brain can access just like that. It's a capacity he did not have before his injury. But a brain injury shouldn't extend your neurological abilities. It should harm them, shouldn't it? It's baffling to contemporary science, but our world mythologies and ancestral narratives have an explanation. Sometimes the abilities that are unlocked by acquired Savant Syndrome are mathematical, to do with memory, to do with physics. There's a guy who sees the mathematical structure of everything that he looks at. Sometimes it's language, sometimes it's music. There was a fascinating study done by Dr. Drago in 2006 that studied the works of an artist. 22 works of art were assessed by a team of art critics. All different kinds of art critics from all different schools came and looked at this lady's work. They weren't told anything about the artist. They weren't told anything about the dates of when the paintings were produced. They just were invited to give their critique. The technical skills, compositional skills, colour, all those kinds of things, every aspect to be looked at. And then the critiques were all collated against the date of the pictures. Now, what the art critics had not been told was that 6 of those paintings had been produced by this lady before she started displaying symptoms of dementia. And the other 16 were all from periods as her brain deteriorated progressively as a result of the dementia. When they read the critiques against the timeline, they realized that this lady's artistic abilities were lifting and lifting and lifting. Her technical skills, her creativity, the compositional skills, everything, every measure was lifting. Now, how is that possible? Dr. Bruce Miller is Professor of Neurology at the University of California, and between 1996 and the year 2000, he catalogued 12 cases of acquired Savant Syndrome. His explanation of this pattern is that we are witnessing a decreased inhibition of visual systems in the brain. Now, a layperson listens to that and says, well, what are inhibitors doing in our brains that they can be switched off so that we can be cleverer? That's a rather counterintuitive explanation. By 2018, Dr. Darrell Trefford at Marion University had tracked more than 70 cases of acquired Savant Syndrome. Dr. Mark Lithgow of University College London talks about how a degeneration in some of the brain's systems may release untapped cognitive abilities. Well, what are advanced cognitive abilities doing in our brains in the off position so that by accident they can be switched on? It's counterintuitive, our science baffles at it, but our world mythologies and ancestral narratives have an explanation. Maybe a mind-boggling one, but it's coherent with the patterns that we see in acquired Savant Syndrome. We all want to be smarter, but none of us want to have a central nervous system injury or a brain event. Is there some way of tapping these advanced cognitive abilities without having an accident? Mystical and shamanic traditions have always said yes, and that's what they're all about. As I've studied some of the ancestral narratives and world mythologies that talk about who we are as a species, where we've come from, and what our potential is, there's a story that re-emerges. A story that has to do with our evolution as a species and external interventions in that process. If you go to the ancient Greek narratives, the Sumerian, African, Mesoamerican, and my book Escaping from Eden argues it's there in Genesis as well. There's a story of external interventions upgrading our ancestors' neurological capacities to hear, to hear, to hear, and then there's a downgrade to bring us down to here to make us more easily managed. All the stories have a moment where our ancestors were brought to this level, where they were capable of a little bit more, where they could do things like remote view, where they had things like precognition, insight to perceive things beyond the immediate physical surroundings, self-healing, things we would all love to be able to release in our own lives. Mystical and shamanic traditions from those same cultures say yes, there are ways of tapping our untapped cognitive abilities and living at a higher level of consciousness. One of the modalities that I've studied has to do with controlled conscious breathing. Now, this is a pattern that you can find in all kinds of spiritual and mystical traditions from all around the world. It doesn't belong just to a single religious tradition. I learned it from the hesychasts of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and from this guy in particular behind me, Saint Seraphim of Sarov. Now, in his experience, through a practice of silence, stillness, and controlled conscious breathing, he was able to achieve all those things I was just talking about: precognition, remote viewing, inexplicable insight, and powers of healing. And from him, I learned this practice. Now, there are a couple of different ways of doing it. The hesychasts did it like this. They would slow their breathing and make it more rhythmic through the use of the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And they would repeat these words over and over. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, would be the intake of breath. Have mercy on me, a sinner, would be the output of breath. And they would use a particular physical posture. So what they would do is they would curl themselves up into a position like this, with the head buried in the chest, getting their head as close to their heart as they could. And then as they breathed, they would picture the breath going in through the nostrils and down to the heart. And that was the visual meditation they would use as they did this pattern of prayer, slowing their breathing, uniting the consciousness of their minds with the consciousness of their hearts, until they were in a place of heightened consciousness, heightened awareness, that they called the state of attention. And though the practitioners of hesychasm were seeking only one thing, which was union with God, they often reported other particular phenomena: remote viewing, precognition, powers of healing, and other paranormal phenomena. And as I've practiced controlled conscious breathing in that way, I've experienced the same things. Not at the same rate as my friend Saint Seraphim of Sarov, but enough to show me the power of this spiritual practice. I'll just give you a personal, for instance, of some of the things I've experienced through controlled conscious breathing. I was living in Victoria, and it was a time when I was really needing to take some time to reflate and recover from a very pressured time at work. And I was doing this in a number of ways, and I started earthing myself. So I would be walking barefoot in nature, and I would sleep on an earthing mat. And I knew that something had happened to me straight away, because it instantly, overnight, fixed my sleep apnea. From the moment I slept on an earthing mat, I never again woke up coughing and spluttering in the middle of the night. It stopped just like that. And so I'd get out into nature every day, walk in the bush, walk barefoot, get some sunlight on my skin as well. That's how I would begin every day. And so I'd begin every day facing the sun, letting the sun shine on my skin, getting my beta endorphins going. And then I'd breathe in, take the breath up, picture it going up into my mind, right into the core of my brain, into the pineal gland. And as I did that, I began to feel more myself, more human, more healthy, more awake. And I began to notice some funny phenomena. A musician phoned me up one day. He wanted to come and do a gig at my church. I'd never met him before, but as soon as I spoke to him on the phone, I knew exactly what he looked like. A picture of him came right to my mind. So much so that a couple of weeks later, he walked into a room randomly, and I recognized him from the vision I'd had when we'd spoken on the phone. We were preparing to sell our house at that time, and I went into the estate agents. I was looking to find a painter who could come and paint the exterior of the house to prepare it for sale. And the agent said, "Oh, my husband does house painting." And as she spoke those words, an image came into my mind. I knew exactly what her husband looked like. I'd never met him before. Sure enough, when a week later he turned up to assess the job, he was exactly as I'd seen in my mind's eye a week before. One time, I was doing my earthing, barefoot walking in the Yarra Ranges, and it was a beautiful sunny day, and I was just taking that time to breathe. And as I did that, an echidna walked up to me, right up to my foot, and stopped and looked up at me. And we stayed like that for some minutes. It was amazing. It was a beautiful experience. I carried on my walk, and after a little while I needed to pause for a call of nature. And as I took a pause, a little mountain pygmy possum scuttled up to my foot, stopped at my foot and looked up at me. It was a really cute little creature. A little while after that, I was walking along and two swamp wallabies hopped up to me and stayed really close to me as I walked by. Now that's very unusual. They're usually very shy animals, but they just stayed close watching. And I thought, wow, beautiful. I wonder what I'm going to see next. And as soon as I asked myself that question, the image of a 5-foot-long goanna flashed into my mind. It was like I felt it here. I'm going to see a goanna next. But as soon as I had that picture in my mind, my rational mind came in and said, no, that's not going to happen. They don't live in Victoria. They don't live this far south. They live up in the Northern Territory. They live up in northern Queensland. They don't live in the Yarra Ranges. But sure enough, about 4 minutes later, standing right in the middle of the path, looking straight at me, was a 5-foot-long goanna. Now, in the past, when I had funny experiences, I would process them in a particular way. My worldview was that God communicates with human beings through the church, that the Christians get these insights and pass them on to the world at large. But by this point in my life, I knew that God was a bit bigger than that. On the day of Pentecost, the Apostle Peter says the Spirit of God is poured out on all flesh, not just on religious people or spiritual people or Christians. And these experiences I was having of remote viewing and precognition didn't fit that pattern. And I began to realize this was about my brain beginning to switch on in a new kind of way. This wasn't something just for spiritual or religious people. This has to do with our potential experience, every one of us, as human beings. Let me come back to the question of the explanation. How come there are advanced cognitive abilities, untapped abilities in our brains in the off position? Well, when you read the creation mythologies of the ancient Sumerians, the Mesoamericans, African stories, Greek stories, and the Elohim stories of Genesis, the explanation is that we all have these abilities in our brains because they were placed there. What are inhibitors doing in our brains? They were placed there by those who came and intervened in our evolution as a species. And many of the cultures that have curated that explanation of human origins have their methods and modalities. They all have the idea that we can operate at a higher level, more conscious, more intelligent, and ultimately more harmonious with the world in which we live. Plato, the Greek philosopher, spoke about a kykeon ceremony, tea that had certain psychoactive properties. In Central and South America, there are similar traditions over there. There are smoke and smoking ceremonies. There's controlled conscious breathing, which I've learned about. What might our society look like? What would our politics and economics be like if we could live more conscious? As I continue to study the world's ancient mythologies and ancestral narratives, that's the question that excites me. What kind of life might you live and might I live if we can be more conscious, more intelligent, more creative, less inhibited? What then is possible for you and for me?
Author and researcher Paul Wallis probes the world's ancient mythologies for clues about the origins of the human race and has published several books in the field of mysticism and spirituality. In the last decade, his work has probed the world's ancient mythologies for the insights they hold on our origins as a species and our potential as human beings. Paul's work in church ministry has included training pastors in the interpretation of biblical texts, working as a troubleshooter for communities of faith, and serving as an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. His background as a senior churchman makes it all the more surprising that Paul's latest book argues that human origins lie in our prehistoric contact with extraterrestrial species. Go to www.paulanthonywallis.com for information about Paul and his books. Escaping from Eden, does Genesis teach that the human race was created by God or engineered by ETs?